Hello and welcome to this week. We're talking about the 1920s. Now, this is a decade of great upheaval and great innovation that happens not only in the United States but in the world. And unfortunately, we only get to talk about the United States in this class and not so much about the world around. Honestly, I could teach an entire class on the 1920s, but I'm going to give you some brief highlights this week. The 1920s is referred to as the Roaring 20s in the United States, or the tumultuous 20s, but most historians call this part of the Interwar Period. And the Interwar Period spans from the end of World War I in 1918 to the beginning of World War II in 1939. So this is a main part of it, and it has world ramifications that result from this. And so in this this lecture series this week, we are going to be you'll have a brief overview of the 1920s, and then we're going to be looking specifically at prohibition and the Volstead Act, and then we'll transition to the Scopes Monkey trial. We're going to have a lecture on eugenics. Even though eugenics doesn't begin in the 1920s, it has a big movement that occurs in the 20s that has ramifications all the way into the 1980s. We're going to be talking about medicine and forensics a little bit. This is the beginning of forensic science-based criminology. We're going to talk about how that actually plays into prohibition, particularly with Alexander Gettler and Charles Norris. And then we're going to also end this course on the Florida land boom. A lot of this stuff is not in your textbook, and some of it is. And we're going to be going through things that are a little bit outside of probably what you know about the 1920s. As I mentioned, it is a period of a lot of turmoil. We just get out of World War I, which it has world ramifications. The United States actually plays a very small part, and we don't have as many effects from World War I as the rest of the world, since we didn't have as much fighting. World War I was extremely detrimental to not only Europe, obviously, but Asia as well, and Africa. There's a lot of death and a lot of fighting that happens outside of the trench warfare as well. And the United States enters very late and plays a very minor role overall if you're looking at the grand scheme of World War I. And out of a result of this, Woodrow Wilson and the United States takes most of the credit for it. We come in within a few months shy of the end of the war. It would have been ending anyway, probably to an Allied defeat versus an Axis win, and the United States pretty much doesn't come in until we have enough self-interest, and primarily because Woodrow Wilson saw it as a chance to promote United States diplomacy and doctrine throughout not only the world, but kind of show that we can negotiate the peace. Regardless of what is going on outside of the world. Also, during this time, as you have the influenza, the Spanish flu, which is actually a misnomer now, because it did not originate in Spain, even though that was the rumor, so hence we call it the Spanish flu. And with the mass death, where 500 million people are infected by this flu, and has between any estimates between 20 to 50 million, and this is probably on the low side, 50 million people who die as a result of this. That's over 10% of the, or at least 10% of the population that is infected. And so there's a lot of death that is coming out of it. And the 1920s, in many ways, particularly in the United States and other places, is a reaction to that, to the great change in the World's Fair. Some historians argue that the world is completely changed, so it was no longer recognizable after World War I. World War I is the catalyst for all change in the world. It is when technology starts to boom. It's when we get more consumerism. It's mass death. We get these great reform policies, particularly in Europe, with healthcare systems, which the United States actually doesn't really adopt into the Affordable Health Care Act. and even then it's very minor compared to the world system. You have global changes in how we deal with different nations, from the US as well, and you get a great boom of wealth that happens, and then a crashing depression that happens in the 1930s. So this is kind of a broad overview of what we're going to be talking about. In the United States, in the 1920s has some weird things that happen that doesn't happen in the rest of the world. For example, in the 1920s, these great men kind of Europe, and great doesn't mean necessarily good, but in a larger scale of influential people, come into power and end up making their federal governments being larger and have a broader base that comes out of this. You have civil wars in Europe, and some of the people that begin to rise are Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini. You get Vladimir Lenin in Russia, as well as Stalin comes out of this, and then purges that result. You have in Spain, you have a Spanish Civil War that occurs, and a great amount of upheaval in the Middle East as well that happens during this time. The Ottoman Empire completely collapses, and people have to rebuild states out of this time. In the United States, where a lot of the governments and a lot of these dictators or totalitarians or monarchs that arise out of this, United States begins to shrink their federal government and undoes a lot of those labor reform laws that are happening. There are still mass demonstrations of labor that occur during this period. There are mass demonstration for women during this period. There's an entire youth culture that goes kind of rogue, if you will. In the 1920s, you also have increased xenophobia that happens as a result from World War I, with immigration laws that changed in 1921 and 1924. That increases restrictions to the United States, as we kind of talked with the Chinese Exclusion Act. You have the re-establishment and rise of the KKK. It becomes more prominent at this time. It had never fully died, but it comes back with a vengeance. And it not only targets African Americans, but it also targets Catholics and Jews for the first time. And this is where you get the rise of anti-Semitism within the United States. You have the first Catholic presidential candidate, Al Smith, that comes about in 1928. He ends up failing to receive the nomination. As we'll talk, you have the Scopes monkey trial that happens in 1925, which is a battle. It's kind of a public relations defeat of fundamentalist Christians versus teaching science, and we'll look into that. You have more, as I said, more increased restrictions on immigration. You have, for the first time, technology that gets innovated more in the home, more since the Golden Age, and this includes refrigerators and radios in every home and every car. Cars become very rampant. You get improved city conditions with sanitation and water development. Also, in this time, you get high levels of employment and rising wages. There's a wage increase that happens, but simultaneously you have the dismissal of a lot of women from the workforce that happens. With the 1920s, you also get, as I said a little bit earlier, the rise in pop culture and youth culture that happens. Among ordinary families, people were being more invested in arts, and particularly in the movie industry. And there's silent films until 1927, and then you get the first talking film. You get popular entertainment that rises, and the worship of entertainers. You have for the first time that people are living healthier in cities, and you get actually an increase in life expectancy. But at the same time, you have where the Volstead Act goes through, which is prohibition and illegal, makes it illegal to drink, that you have everyday people becoming criminals. And criminality at this time was viewed as very normal and, as I said, very glamorized. You have people such as Al Capone and Roy Olmsted who get this kind of celebrity-like status. And we're not, we'll be talking about gangsters a little bit in my prohibition section. At the same time, you have what is known as the Great Migration, and this is African Americans from the South to the North, you get, in fact, all African American conclaves within the North, such as Harlem, in New York. And Harlem ends up not only becoming a hub for African Americans, you have this greater education among African Americans that happen, as well as campaigns by the NAACP, the the National Association of Colored People, and you get this understanding of a new Negro, as the term was in 1925. That happens. These are people who are who change the world with music and art, and all of a sudden you not only have people that are listening to this music, and this music is jazz. It's the first really popularized fully American music that doesn't have a link back to Europe. And in my live lecture classes, I actually bring in a jazz band and we play some things and we talk about the importance of this group, but we don't get to do that here, unfortunately. So it is the first rise that happens, and it happens from the African American communities in the North, and then time and time again it is repeated by white culture as well as other minority cultures throughout the United States. You have jazz musicians that cross the segregated boundary of groups, and one group in particular, you have Benny Goodman's group, who hires Ella Fitzgerald for a while, and she goes on tour with them. You have musicians who want to play with the best, and they don't care about color as much. And out of this, you have clubs that are known as the Black and Tans that allow both white and African Americans. And just understand, jazz doesn't just come out of African American communities. Later on, you also get Latin American communities that are incorporating this jazz to a new spin. And you get them in different pockets of different immigrants. It hits the world by stage, but at the same time, it's a youth popular culture. It was seen as kind of demonized by a lot of more conservative people. You also get, for the first time, a youth culture that gets to use cars. So there's a lot of outcry that happens because of this. You have, for the first time, teenagers taking their dates in cars and going necking, and this big fear. Women at this time completely change their appearance for the most part. You get a new innovation of the new woman, and that is the flapper. The flapper cuts her hair, she wears makeup, she's wearing clothes that are loose and not corseted, and are showing your legs, and wearing stockings, and having this more new sensuality. Also at this time, you get a rise in psychology that happens with Freud, who arguably is good and has some good philosophies that really change this period, as well as has some detrimental philosophies. But one of the things Freud does is he talks about this sexually oppressed how sexually oppressed the United States as well as the world is, and that we need to change this. And so you get this this rise of people who are fighting back against this, and this is usually the younger generation fighting back against more conservative and the older generation. As I mentioned before, the federal government begins to shrink. You have this paranoia that's coming on, and this is the advent of the Red Scare, this understanding that communism from Russia is in fact going to take over the United States, and this is kind of sets up for the Cold War later. There was a lot of issues that are happening at this time. There was this fear of immigrants rising up. There's a fear of uncertainty about the LGBTQIA, which is not referred to at the time, that that homosexuals are going to come into your home. There is a fear that the morality from a Protestant look is Protestant outlook is being replaced by science, and at the same time this same science is used to justify a movement of eugenics, which has mass sterilization of people, primarily women, throughout 38 states. You have people who go on tour supporting these that are supporting limiting not only the birth rate, but who should give birth, because the science was showing a flawed version of Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest, from the origins of the species and the origins of man, and kind of a flawed view of that, of saying, well, look, we have this science, we need to be able to control various things. At the same time, in the 1920s, you have these eugenic sterilizations are primarily federally funded, not just locally funded. But you also have federally funded poisonings of alcohol-like substitutes that take out the United States. And on top of this, there's a crisis that happens in Florida known as the Florida land boom and bust. And this kind of sets up everything with the rising wages and the unrestricted buying and selling on speculation that happens in the 1920s, and buying on credit and mispractices that had been going on for a long time, is setting up for a great crash in 1929 that results in the Great Depression. We're not going to talk a lot about the Great Crash in this week, but we will next week when we are discussing the Great Depression. So hopefully this gives you a view of how complex this week is, and we're going to be talking a lot about things that either your book talks about tangentially, or that you probably haven't heard of, particularly in regards to Alexander Gettler and Charles Norris, who not only single-handedly get forensic science within the United States, but also are some of the main people against the prohibition and how they get that changed, which is a great feat that happens. So I hope you enjoy this week on the 1920s.